Hello and welcome to part 2 of Normal Exploitation, Normal Resistance, which is chapter 2 of Weapons of the Week. So this is a continuation from the last video, and I'm going to be covering the next parts of this chapter. So the author outlines that the main idea in this book is everyday forms of resistance, and that he is going to discuss the sort of power that these have. He mentions that a peasant-backed revolution, actually, if it actually succeeds in taking power, the results at very best are usually sort of a mixed blessing. They usually they have bad implications as well, bad results as well. So what he is saying that it seems far more important to understand what we might call everyday forms of peasant resistance. So he then goes on to explain what these ordinary weapons of the relatively powerless groups are. For instance, foot dragging, dissimulation, false compliance, pilfering, feigned ignorance, slander, arson, sabotage, and so forth. So then he says that to understand these commonplace forms of resistance is to understand what much of the peasantry does between revolts to defend its interests as best it can. And I noted this down as a very important point, because I think that this sort of shows, it really shows what's happening for lower class people in these societies in the bigger amount of time. It's when we often just study revolts and things like that, but we don't study the lead up to these revolts. So I think this is a very good point made by James Scott. So then he goes on to to say that these modes of resistance are not trivial, even though they don't have necessarily what he says a monopoly on these sort of weapons of the weak. He says that they are actually quite powerful. So an example he gives of this is the collapse of the Confederate Army and economy in the course of the Civil War in the United States. He says that it is a further example of the decisive role of silent and undeclared defection. So when people defected from the army, apparently nearly 250,000 eligible whites are estimated to have deserted or have avoided conscription altogether. These reasons appear to have been both moral and material, as one might expect. So he's sort of showing how this not indirect confrontation has brought down a whole army, and then let's look. So then he explains more what everyday resistance is. So he says that where institutionalized politics is formal, overt, and concerned with systematic local change, everyday resistance, I don't know if that's local, I'm not sure what's. He says de jure change, so I can't remember what that means, so you'd have to look that up or try and work out what that means. So where institutional politics is like concerned with that and systematic change, everyday resistance is usually concerned with largely immediate like de facto gains. So what actually happens, it's concerned with the on the ground what's actually happening in society. So for instance, here's just a random example. The Chinese government might set a goal and say we'd like it to happen like this, and then everyday resistance and through the peasantry or through the people on the ground, that everyday resistance is informal, often covert, and everyone in that group might resist it and actually change the on the ground impact. So for most subordinate classes, which as a matter of sheer history have little prospect of improving their status, this form of resistance has been the only option. So I think this again is quite a good point, in that he's saying that even though there are these big powerful people who set these goals, the lower classes are able to use these everyday resistance, forms of everyday resistance, to mitigate and change what is actually happening on the ground level. So that is part 2, guys. Give us a like if you enjoyed it, and I will be back for, I believe, one more.